This pandemic has brought everybody to the same level. Rich, poor, educated, uneducated, all of them crying out for the one little thing that we take for granted: oxygen, air.
Breathing seems like a basic human right, but when you have COVID, it's not. First, it was my mom who got infected. I had to go and buy the drip to put it myself because she was in such a bad shape. And when I was there, still nursing my mom, I got a phone call that my daughter Valerie is sick.
I started coughing and I was struggling to breathe. I was isolating myself, and then my son wanted to come and touch me and see me.
My husband, he was also very sick. They are both just saying, we can't breathe, we can't breathe. I'm in Zimbabwe, we needed an ICU bed, we needed oxygen, and there was nothing.
Good afternoon, Zimbabwe. I'm one of the specialist physicians in the COVID unit. Today has been a very difficult day. It feels like a bloodbath. Literally since morning, there's been death upon death. Patients who are losing have not been vaccinated, and their condition progresses unabated until they can't breathe, and they come to us very desperate.
When my family was almost dying, there was not one single vaccine. It makes me really sad because this has happened before and we lost millions of people to HIV. When in the West, people were already living normal lives. For how long are we going to sit and just look at people dying again?
Since the pandemic started, we've lost a quarter of these patients. And this is the only hospital providing critical care support in northern Uganda. We have the poorest vaccination status of the whole world.
Rich countries talking about going back to business is normal. And WHO has challenged them to stop this vaccine apartheid and to stop the boosters until everyone is vaccinated. We want them to share the vaccines, share the recipe, so that countries like South Africa can produce vaccines for Africa. India is in the same situation. They can do it. India breaks my heart. Those stories of people dying in the streets. It's so important that we vaccinate the whole world. I will continue to fight for access to vaccines until my own last breath.
Audience, but also everybody obviously online for this hybrid event tonight. We've got like a load of inspirational speakers from around the world who are going to be addressing you. And we are going to be talking about an issue which really goes to the heart of the injustice in our global economy, and that is vaccine inequality. While we here in the global north have vaccinated 55 to 65% of our populations, the entire African continent has only been able to vaccinate 3% of its population. Low-income countries have only been able to vaccinate 0.5% of their populations. And the reason for this is not simply that we haven't donated enough, it's that we have got a system of pharmaceutical research, development and manufacture which monopolizes the know-how, the recipes, the technology behind our most important medical innovations in the hands of a handful of multinational corporations who monopolize that knowledge in order to profit and profiteer from medical knowledge that very often we as taxpayers have paid for. And so it really goes to the heart of why some parts of the world are so poor and some parts of the world are still so rich. And what we're going to do tonight is describe the problem, talk a little bit more in depth about it, but then also talk about what's happening and how we can get involved in a movement to stop this and to create the kind of global economy that all of us at the World Transform believe in and that we should expect in the 21st century. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Maaza Seyoum, who is the partnerships lead for African Alliance. And African Alliance was formed as a queer-led organization to provide space where some of the African continent's best minds could come together to better develop and advance Pan-Africanist and feminist perspectives. Maaza is also the African lead for the People's Vaccine Alliance. The People's Vaccine Alliance is one of the central institutions globally that's been mobilizing for vaccine equality. And so Maaza's going to lay out the problem in a little bit more depth and describe some of the solutions. Over to you, Maaza.
Great. Thank you, Nick. I hope everyone can hear me. It's truly an honor to be here at this festival that inspires people to imagine, demand, and build a world transformed. As Nick has said, I'm here as a representative of the African Alliance, and we are active members of the People's Vaccine Alliance, which is fighting for equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines for all. So a big thank you to Nick and Global Justice Now for inviting me to represent African civil society at this rally for a people's vaccine. So just 18 months ago, even the world's leading health experts would not have been able to imagine the situation that we are in now. More than 200 million people have been infected during this pandemic, and over 4.5 million people have died. So thanks to unprecedented global collaboration on research and taxpayer investments, as well as people all over the world, including in Africa, volunteering to participate in clinical trials, science has triumphed, and we saw the development of not one, but several safe and effective vaccines in record time. Many of us watched in awe as the first Pfizer vaccine was administered in the UK on December 8th of last year. I don't know how many of you remember that day. I was quite emotional watching those clips of that lovely grandmother receiving her jab. She was the first person to be vaccinated outside of a clinical trial. On that day, we showed that we could overcome an unbelievable scientific challenge. But since then, we have failed miserably to overcome the challenge of inequality. Today, 10 whole months after that first Pfizer vaccine, just 2% of people living in the world's poorest countries have been fully vaccinated. This, while the majority of people in rich countries, as Nick has said, are fully vaccinated, and some countries are starting to roll out booster shots. In the UK, you are lucky enough to have 65% of people fully jabbed, but at the same time, only 4% of people across the African continent have the same privilege. I checked the figures in my own country today, my country of Ethiopia, and just 0.63% of the population has been fully vaccinated. This grotesque inequality in access to COVID-19 vaccines continues while 10,000 people die each day due to the virus. This vaccine apartheid is immoral and it's foolish. Scientists warned us months ago that failing to vaccinate people around the world as quickly as possible would lead to the development of new variants that would threaten public health everywhere. And sure enough, we saw that happen with the Delta variant. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies, after benefiting from taxpayer investment for the development of these vaccines, refuse to share critical technology and know-how to allow a ramp up of vaccine production by capable companies around the world. They use patronizing and racist language to tell us that factories in Africa and Asia would not be able to manufacture their vaccines. This is complete nonsense. India is basically the pharmacy of the world, producing over half the medicines that are used all over the globe. And factories in Botswana, Rwanda, Senegal, and South Africa, as well as across Latin America, are ready to make these new vaccines as soon as they get the recipes and the know-how. But as they continue to block ramp up of manufacturing, these companies, including Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer, keep overcharging for the meager available supply. They are literally fattening their wallets while people die, while new variants bubble up, and while the pandemic is prolonged. Another racist argument they have started to peddle is that Africans are resistant to science and that hesitancy rather than scarcity is the problem. There is no evidence to support the notion that Africans are more hesitant than other people to vaccines. In fact, what the evidence does show is that low and middle income countries have higher vaccine acceptance than even the United States. Our countries have huge experience with large-scale campaigns for polio, measles, and all sorts of other vaccines. The audacity of these people to claim that vaccine hesitancy would be the problem when we are literally in a vaccine desert is enraging. All of this to delay a ramp up of global manufacturing so they can maintain control of production and continue to amass wealth. During the last year, while they've been spouting this nonsense, 9 pharmaceutical company CEOs have become billionaires. Unfortunately, we're not new to this. I know that my friend Varsha will talk a bit more about this in a bit, but I just want to briefly remind all of us that before Africa had access to affordable HIV meds and went on to develop some of the most successful treatment programs in the world, one of the excuses used to delay our access was that we wouldn't be able to adhere to HIV medication because we didn't have watches and we didn't know how to tell time. What we see today with COVID-19 vaccines is just a pathetic remix of what we heard with antiretrovirals 20 years ago. So as the third wave hit Africa very hard over the last few months and ICU beds were filled, oxygen ran out, and nurses and doctors who had yet to receive their first COVID vaccines began to see stadiums full of people enjoying Premier League matches in the UK, we were clearly devastated and enraged. Every weekend, we turn on the TV to watch players take a knee in support of Black Lives Matter. I want to believe that most people attending this festival support that gesture, as I do. But if Black Lives Matter in the US, they should also matter in Ethiopia, in Zimbabwe, in Senegal. It is unconscionable that wide-scale booster programs are being rolled out in countries like the UK, while 94% of people in Africa have yet to receive even one jab. So I know that many of you are activists and probably want to know what you can call for. The People's Vaccine Alliance has developed some concrete asks, and I want to quickly go through them with you now. Number one, we need to seriously commit to the World Health Organization's targets for global vaccine rollout. The WHO called for vaccinating 40% of every country's population by December of this year and 70% by the middle of next year. We are woefully behind on this. Number two, ensuring that vaccine technology and know-how is shared by pharmaceutical companies. We need to shame them the way we did about HIV medication. Number three, supporting the proposal submitted by India and South Africa at the World Trade Organization to temporarily waive relevant IP restrictions on the production of vaccines and other COVID-19 technologies. Rich country governments, including Germany, Switzerland, and unfortunately the UK, are blocking the approval of the TRIPS waiver, which has been called for by over 100 other countries. Even the US government has said it supports this proposal. You must push your government to support it as well. Number four, invest in public financing to increase vaccine research and development and manufacturing capacity around the world. And finally, reallocate vaccine doses now. Countries with vaccine oversupply that have already achieved high vaccination coverage must urgently redistribute COVID-19 vaccines they are hoarding. We demand transparency and a real timeline to make this happen. There has been so much press about these pledges of donation. Every time a rich country leader gets up to say that his administration has donated doses, there are rounds of applause. But where are those doses? To date, not even 1/5 of those vaccines have materialized. Your country, the UK, has committed to 91 million doses, but only 8 million of them have been delivered. We have fewer than 100 days left until the end of the year. If this redistribution doesn't actually happen, the goal of vaccinating 40% of the population in low and middle income countries before the end of the year will not be reached. What we are asking for as African civil society and as the People's Vaccine Alliance is not charity, it is justice and common sense. What this pandemic has reminded us is that we are all in this together. We need you, our allies, to remind your leaders that nationalism is not the way to address a global crisis. None of us is safe until we are all safe. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maaza, for pointing out and highlighting the atrocious racism that's built into the global economy. And as committed anti-racists, as I'm sure you all are, we have to fight racism not only here in our own country, but in the global economy around COVID and much more widely. Thank you, Maaza. Our next speaker is from India. So it's a little bit late for her at the moment, so a special thank you for agreeing to make it. Varsha Gandikota Nalutla, sorry Varsha, I work with you all the time, but don't always say your last name. It's from Progressive International. She's the head of vaccine internationalism at Progressive International. Progressive International unites, organizes and mobilizes progressive voices from around the world. And particularly during COVID, what I've been really inspired by is the way they've brought together progressive governments in the global south to begin to resist, but also to begin to start building a different economy on the ground now, so that they can begin manufacturing their own vaccines. There were some incredible scenes at the UN General Assembly this week where government, world leader after world leader, got up and lectured northern leaders, leaders of Western countries, about the shocking inequality. And indeed, the UN General Secretary, a diplomat, remember, not a campaigner, described it thus: "This is a moral indictment of the state of our world. It is an obscenity," he said at the General Assembly this week. Varsha, tell us a little bit more about what you're doing.
Always great to listen to Maaza, and I couldn't be thrilled to be here with comrades John, Vijay, Rhiannon, and Deborah, and of course the wonderful Nick, who I can confirm you've said my last name correctly, Nick, so kudos to you. Right before I came onto this panel, I was asked by a friend about what I thought of Joe Biden's new announcement. Joe Biden held a global summit this week where he announced that the US would donate 500 million doses of vaccine to poor countries around the world. Now, this is an extremely annoying question to be asked, and I've been asked it a lot this week, because what am I expected to say? I don't want the vaccines, I don't want more donations, of course not. But as of this morning, as Nick and Maaza have both mentioned, the US has begun rolling out booster shots. The UK is going to have its own program soon, even as in the entire continent of Africa, less than 3% of the population is vaccinated. So the question isn't more donations or less, although we certainly need more. Let's remind ourselves we're a planet of 7.7 billion people, which means over 15 billion doses of vaccines, and a few million here and there, and 500 million is just a drop in the bucket. So the more important question is, how on earth are we in a situation today, nearly 2 years into the pandemic, where a majority of the countries of the world find themselves arms outstretched, waiting for charity from a handful of countries? And importantly, what can we do today that will ensure that when the next crisis does come, this won't be the case? So let's look at a little bit at what happened during this pandemic. Within months of the first case, the Chinese authorities sequenced the virus and shared that information on a public website. There was no patent, nothing was under lock and key, and scientists from around the world collaborated in an unprecedented fashion to understand the virus and to fight it. So just for a moment, it seemed like things were going to be different. I remember a New York Times headline at the time that said, "COVID-19 changed how the world does science together." And I certainly believed it. I'm sure at least some of you did. I don't know if this is an embarrassing admission to make on this PWT stage of naive optimism, because what has followed has been so absolutely miserable. Although I do think as leftists, we all have to be, in some sense, lovers of hope. But then a series of things happened, right? One, the World Health Organization announced an initiative for a common pool of vaccines without patents. That same day, Donald Trump vowed to cut ties with the WHO and threatened to walk out with complete impunity. A day before this announcement, top executives from pharma companies, including Pfizer, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, convened a press conference to oppose any challenge to patents. And over the next few months, this assault continued. When Pfizer learned that Australia was considering supporting the waiver of patent protections, they made a submission in the Parliament saying it would harm supply, it would harm safety, and so on. And Pritchett, whose voice haunts my nightmares, a senior vice president of the Pharma Industries Trade Association, repeatedly came out in public and said this is going to be disastrous for innovation. And so this initiative that was now proposed over a year ago, no company has shared its technology as of yet, and the initiative gathers dust. So one might say, this is just what's expected of pharma companies. But what about the other actors in the system? What do we expect of our governments, of international bodies which are set up to deal with this pandemic, which, by the way, have ended up being influenced or led directly by the very same pharma executives and billionaires? So if you look at, say, some of the investigative work done by Corporate Europe Observatory about who meets with the European Commission to discuss the scarcity of COVID vaccines, it turns out the commissioner almost exclusively meets with lobbyists who put big pharma's agenda first. So in the first half of this year, in 2021, there was something like 117 meetings with pharma lobbyists out of a total of 150 or so, with NGOs like Doctors Without Borders not being granted even a single meeting. You can even consider someone like Bill Gates, right, who's at the helm of every global health project. He leveraged his influence to convince Oxford University not to open license its vaccine. And he did this by leveraging his donation to the university research program to change the terms of the agreement, even though we know now the vaccine is developed entirely in a publicly funded lab. So you fast forward a few months and the AstraZeneca vaccine is being sold for $6 a dose in Uganda, compared to something like $1.5 to $2 a dose in the rest of Europe. And one private company in India here is producing its doses, even as well over 30 public sector drug manufacturing units lie idle. And this is the story everywhere. Moderna, a vaccine funded almost entirely by US taxpayer money, does not belong to the US government. Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine funded mainly by UK taxpayer money does not belong to the UK government. So governments of these countries had the chance to make these vaccines a public good, but instead signed away the right, not just of the people, the right to health of their people in their own country, but world over, to protect profits. So big pharma companies have been allowed to decide how much, where, and with whom to manufacture, ensuring that we end up in this situation of vaccine apartheid. These last 2 years have been so horrid and played out so perfectly to the tune of big capital that it is really hard not to feel like an idiot for having, believed that this would be some kind of rupture in history. Because we find ourselves here, a situation where rich countries have hoarded much of the world's vaccine supply, are preventing the rest of the world from producing their own vaccines, and every time they're questioned about it, talk about donations. And let's talk about the damn donations, right? The biggest donations project, the COVAX project, which is supposed to subsidize vaccine deals with poor countries, has completely failed to meet its goal, has fallen short on all of its pledges. Haiti has received less than half of what it was supposed to. Syria, I think about a 10th or 9th of what it was supposed to. Venezuela is yet to receive even a single dose. And in something like late June or July, COVAX sent 500,000 doses to Britain, more than double the amount sent that month to the entire continent of Africa. So just think about this for a moment. COVAX is an aid outfit that has popped up in the middle of a humanitarian emergency, presented itself as the only international solution, and allowed rich countries to steal from doses meant for poor countries. And it's stunning to me that there isn't a huge investigation into this wrongdoing. And I suppose that's the case because it's serving its real purpose, which is to keep much of the world dependent on the whims and politics of rich countries for donations, as has been the case in the past. Maaza, speaking before me, mentioned the AIDS crisis. During one of the worst periods of the HIV crisis in South Africa, Pfizer was selling its branded drug for $30, even as a cheap generic version was available from Thailand at the cost of, I think, about 5 cents. And the cost to make it was, of course, far lower than even the 5 cents. And when South Africa decided to go against Pfizer's patent and import the cheaper version from Thailand, it was hit by about 39 lawsuits and was put on the US sanctions list in less than 3 years. And you have to remember, thinking about this in context, that the US took about 4 decades, 40 years to place apartheid South Africa on the sanctions watch list, but a democratic South Africa that was trying to protect, the right to health of its people found its place on that list within 3 years. So, when I began working on vaccine internationalism at Progressive International, it was clear proposals from the World Bank, from the IMF, from WTO, from G7, they're all premised on providing charity to the global South while entrenching the dependence of these nations on their northern neighbors. So they're not solutions, only maneuvers to distract from the true nature of the system, which is built to empower big pharma cartel to control the lives of billions of people around the world. I think the clearest articulation of this perhaps came from your own Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who talked about building a quote unquote NATO for public health. Terrifying thought. So what's at stake here really is the sovereignty of the South. We're witnessing the ills of nationalism, imperialism, racial capitalism all play out in the most grotesque of ways in this vaccine race. And for that reason, this issue is perhaps one of the most important struggles of our time. And as activists on the left, we have to be concerned with not just understanding the system underneath it all, but changing it. In the immediate term, we have to look to countries like Cuba, which demand our solidarity. As a small island nation battling a 6-decade economic blockade, not only managed to develop 3 homegrown vaccines, but have pledged to openly collaborate with any interested country. And this was the commitment that they made at the Progressive International Summit this summer, the program that Nick talked about right before I came on. And this is an offer that's unheard of from others in this crisis, and it puts forward a model of vaccine internationalism for the world. So if I could return maybe for just a moment to the hope brought about by, the unprecedented nature of collaboration in April of last year, As socialists, we should all be asking, how can we support radical possibilities in public health? What forms of praxis should we be looking to? So say, how can we support workers across the pharmaceutical supply chain, from storage companies in the shipping industry to plastics, chemical factories in different countries? How can we support trade unions in these places to disrupt the machine, to stand in solidarity with the people of the global south? How might we support open access to science? Why do we not have more whistleblowers, scientists willing to say, here's a piece of the mRNA technology, someone else grab another piece, and we'll put the puzzle together? You know, how can progressive governments engage in collective disobedience against new imperial rules and regulations we know are embodied in our international institutions? So at this time, when qualified vaccine producers all over the world stand ready to produce more vaccines, if they were allowed access to the technology and the know-how that is now being held under lock and key. So the question is, how do we empower them? How do we empower every lab, every factory, every scientist, and every healthcare worker to do so? I know that this discussion will be incomplete without talking about, you know, how over the past few decades, of course, the IMF's austerity programs, increased privatization of public health has really forced all of our governments to cut health spending, to cut healthcare systems, and everywhere they've been decimated. And it's part of a larger process of our time, of course, of decolonization. But I know that Vijay will speak to that in a few minutes far more eloquently than I ever could. So I'll end by saying, we cannot seriously expect a few rich country governments to challenge a global health system that they themselves constructed and that benefits them. Nor can we wait around for, you know, as Maaza said, for fresh promises of charity. But having had the chance to work alongside allies and activists like you here today and those on this panel, I am hopeful that a fighting alliance is in formation, centered on sovereignty for the South, that can write a new international health order. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak here today.
Thanks so much, Varsha, for joining us. I hope you get some sleep now, because as I say, it is really late with you. I want to bring it back home for a few minutes now, because as well as the amazing stuff that's happening around the Global South, and as I say, I think there is real hope in terms of what governments are starting to do now to challenge the role of Big Pharma in the world. There is a big international ask, which is that we override the patents that give the Big Pharma companies their monopolies, and we allow countries around the world to produce these vaccines. We know there are factories lying around the world that cannot produce at the moment because the big pharmaceutical corporations will not allow them to. We are demanding that the WTO waive these patents for everything related to COVID. And that call is supported by virtually the whole of the Global South. Rather surprisingly, it is also supported by the United States of America, by Australia, by New Zealand, and by numerous other Western countries. Guess which countries are not supporting this waiver? Boris Johnson's government here in Britain and Angela Merkel's government in Germany. They are the two big blockers. And we need, over the next weeks, because these negotiations are going to be happening at the World Trade Organization this autumn, we need to put the maximum amount of pressure on Johnson's government to demand that he steps out of the way. If you can't donate and you can't export the drugs you're making, the very least you can do is allow others to produce these drugs, these vaccines, for themselves. And we've got a really vibrant campaign in this country. So Global Justice Now, as part of the People's Vaccine Alliance, is part of a coalition with groups like Stop AIDS, like Just Treatment, like Oxfam, like Médecins Sans Frontières, and like the group that the next speaker represents, the Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, who's going to tell you a little bit more about what's happening in the UK and how this issue fits into what they've been fighting for a long time now, this push to take pharmaceuticals out of the market mechanism and to make our healthcare a human right, not a commodity. Welcome to the stage, Rhiannon and Osborne.
Hi, thank you so much. It's really great to be here, and thanks, as always, to the really amazing speakers that went before me. So my name is Rhiannon. I'm a health justice campaigner, and I work with Universities Allied for Essential Medicines. And what I'm going to talk about today is the horrific problem that the other speakers have just outlined so well, but I'm going to talk about why we should not be surprised. We should be horrified, but we absolutely should not be surprised, because this issue goes far beyond just COVID vaccines. The reason why we're here is because we have an unjust medical innovation system whose main incentive is profit, which is not lined up with public health. Patients' values are their market values, not their values as humans. This is the ultimate form of neoliberalism, and we should be really, really worried about it. So I'm going to go through kind of the process of how we got here. So let's start with what is researched and who pays for it. If you design a medical innovation system where the main incentive that you use in it, like you have maybe regulations to ensure safety and stuff like that, but your main incentive is profit, you're not going to research things that don't make you much money. We have an entire category of diseases called neglected tropical diseases, which have almost nothing in common clinically other than the fact that they affect poor countries and poor patients the most. And similar situations occur for things like preemptive vaccine research, because guess what? Vaccines are not that profitable until there's a pandemic. And this is where public funding steps in to fill the gap, both outside of health emergencies and during them. Billions of direct funding have gone into the research for COVID vaccines, not just COVID vaccines, but also diagnostics and tests, which we can't forget either. There was billions that went into pre-ordering and underwriting all of the contracts, and I was part of a research group that looked into the funding of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and found that over 20 years the vaccine was overwhelmingly 97% publicly and charitably funded. So these really are vaccines that have come from public money, and also, let's not forget, from the bodies of people who give themselves and their time to clinical trials, not just in the UK, but also in Brazil and South Africa, in countries where they still don't have access. And what we're looking at here is a fundamental neoliberal belief that profit always gives us innovation and that profit always gives us progress, and that there are no other ways to incentivize things that we desperately need, like COVID vaccines. So we have this system, and what we've done here is we've socialized the risks and then we've privatized the profits. Because another fundamental belief of neoliberalism is that the market is the best way to distribute resources, including life-saving vaccines. There is little to no public oversight or governance in the interests of public health. The distribution of COVID vaccines globally is literally based on the ability to pay of different governments, and we've completely left life-saving vaccines up to market mechanisms. Individual companies have total control over who gets to produce the vaccines, where they get sold, who they get sold to, and at what price. There's basically no coordination or collaboration globally in the interests of public health or equity, which is evident from the fact that countries like the UK are getting booster jabs, while most of the world still has not even had access to first or second jabs. Countries like the UK don't want to support the WHO pool, which is the technology transfer pool, which previous speakers have talked about, or the TRIPS waiver, which previous speakers have also talked about, because this would involve relinquishing monopoly control that the current companies have, and it will involve sharing the technology widely. Instead, they're using old colonial and lazy arguments about why we shouldn't act. But actually, what they're scared about is what this would mean for global trade, global markets, and neoliberalism, because it would mean challenging markets and the dominance of high-income countries. So what they're looking to do instead is they're looking to go with charity. And this is where we come to what the UK and the EU have promised to do, which is donate doses. And they don't want to do anything else because that would involve structural change. It would involve technology sharing with the global south, it would involve challenging monopolies, and it would involve admitting that sometimes public interest is far, far more important than private interest. They want to donate doses because if people can make it themselves, then they don't need your charity and they don't need your power dynamics. Donations are not sustainable because they're scraps, they're unreliable, and they're few and far between, especially in a pandemic which looks to go on and on and on. And also, charity isn't working. As previous speakers have outlined, the main charity mechanism known as COVAX is simply failing to deliver on its promises because it does not deliver structural change. It relies on the whims of high-income countries who continually bypass it to make their own bilateral deals. And I've forgotten what I was about to say. Thanks. But what we need to do now is stand with the global majority, because these are our governments, these are companies that are based in our countries. I'm speaking from the UK. And we need to fight for vaccine justice, but then we need to fight for tuberculosis and the research that needs to go into that disease, because it mostly affects people living in poverty, so it's massively under-researched and massively under-financed. And then we need to do the same for insulin. And then we need to build an actual medical innovation system which is anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and which is built on public health and not for profit. So thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over to, I think, one of my favorite people in the world. He doesn't know me, but I think we would be best friends. So,
with a message to comrades of the Progressive International regarding the moral duty that we all have to vaccinate humanity to end the pandemic. I want to share with you two numbers. $9,000 billion. $9,000 billion, $9 trillion. This is the sum of money that the G7, the leading economies, central banks, printed to give to the bankers during the pandemic between March of 2020 and today. $9,000 billion. Now for the second number. The International Monetary Fund has come up with an estimate of how much it would cost at the present prices to vaccinate the world using existing vaccines, to vaccinate everyone fully, 2 doses when necessary. 39 billion. So compare and contrast. 9,000, 39. They printed 9,000 for the bankers, and they are still thinking about how to vaccinate the world that would cost only 39. We progressives, of course, never expect the central bankers of the capitalist West to produce the 39 billion, even though it would just be a touch of a button for them, to vaccinate humanity. We do not expect such humanism from them. But comrades, it is essential that we broadcast from the rooftops the news for everyone to listen to, that they printed 9,000 billion and only with 39 they could have ended the pandemic for the world. Because only by demonstrating to good people out there who are not radicalized, who are not part of the Progressive International, who are not leftists, only by explaining to them that we don't need even to wait for socialism, for nationalization of big pharma, for big structural revolutionary changes. A tiny little move of one finger within the existing awful capitalism would have saved humanity from COVID-19, and they're not doing it. This is how we inject outrage in the hearts and minds of good people out there who are not radicalized yet. This is how we radicalize the world in order to be able to end the patent monopoly of big pharma, in order to internationalize, nationalize, socialize, call it whatever you will, big pharma, so that there are no more patents that prevent people from access to pharmaceuticals, vaccines, drugs, whatever is necessary, which is available in order to save lives. So let's do it all. Expose big pharma, big politics, the oligarchy for their lack of willingness to do even things that are consistent with their own awful system in order to save humanity. Work towards ending the patent system, replacing it, for instance, with a prize system. How about having a situation where we say whichever company produces a vaccine against HIV, we'll give them 5-10 billion, but not a patent. Then they will have to make the patent available to everyone. Support existing pharmaceutical companies in Cuba, in Africa, that can produce vaccines today, and start the process of convincing the world out there who are not part of the Progressive International that they should be part of the Progressive International, radicalizing them by means of this combination of, on the one hand, demonstrating to them life-saving changes that could take place even within this global techno-feudalism, as I call global capitalism, and then harvest the ensuing anger in order to create the revolutionary progressive dynamic by which we're going to change the world, vaccinate everyone, and provide the basics to everyone that needs them. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Yanis Varoufakis. And I think that's a really good point about how we communicate this, actually. It is so clear in this situation that the market has failed, that our form of monopoly capitalism has failed. I know one of the things that made me an activist in international issues was looking at what was happening in the late 90s and early 2000s in Southern Africa, where we had invented the medicine, the treatment that could have saved so many hundreds of thousands of lives, that could have prevented suffering, that could have prevented HIV being passed on to the next generation, and we were not willing to give that medicine to the people that needed it because profit was part of the equation, was a priority. And that's happened again and again. The British Empire throughout the 19th century oversaw famines that happened, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, where the main issue was not that there was no food, but the people who were starving could not afford the food, and so the market decided it needed to go somewhere else where people would pay more money for that food. So we have a long history in this country of imposing these market mechanisms on the rest of the world, and it's about time that we stood up to our government and challenged that system and said, no, this is not in our name. Now, our next speaker knows more than a little about the history of British imperialism and British colonialism. We're going back to India again for a TWT regular. He often joins us in person. Obviously, he can't do this year. But Vijay Prashad works at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And he's written some fabulous books, including one called The Darker Nations, which I would thoroughly recommend, which charts a whole period in the post-colonial era when countries that had won their political freedom from empire suddenly realized they weren't as free as they thought that they were going to be, because the international economy that was imposed on them imposed a new dependence. And they rose up as part of the non-aligned movement and the many movement, what Vijay calls the Third World Project, the many social movements around the world supporting the non-aligned movement to challenge that power. And they got a considerable distance before neoliberalism in the 1980s destroyed that movement. And you can see the vast inequality and poverty that's resulted in the last 40 years as a result of that. Vijay will tell you more, and particularly how this issue that we're now seeing in terms of COVID vaccine inequality relates to these geopolitics at a global level. Vijay.
Well, Nick, it's great to be with you, and I hope you can hear me. I'm afraid I'm on the road and have been traveling for the last 2 days. So this is how I have to come to you. I'm sorry about that. 2 days ago, I spent several hours with the new Venezuelan foreign minister and was very pleased to hear him speak about the new bloc that Venezuela has initiated at the United Nations. It's called the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. This morning, I was speaking to Sasha Laurenti, who's the Secretary General of ALBA TCP, the group of 9 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a treaty together set up by Hugo Chavez in 2004. Well, Sasha said something interesting to me. Sasha said that, I wonder if the UN Charter, the United Nations Charter, was put up for a vote today, if today in the General Assembly, the UN Charter was brought forward and countries had to vote for it, I wonder what the vote would look like. Would the United Kingdom, for instance, vote for the UN Charter today? Because the United Kingdom, of course, is a great violator of the UN Charter. Would the United States vote for the UN Charter? Would the French, who are in the middle of a little scrap with the UK and the US, vote for that charter? It's not clear to me. After all, the United States, in the middle of the pandemic, has tightened unilateral sanctions against Venezuela, against Cuba, against almost 30 countries around the planet. That's the reason why the new Venezuelan foreign minister is talking about the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. 18 countries, including Russia and China. By the way, they make up a quarter of the people on the planet, the populations of the Group of Friends. This is more legitimate to call them an international community than, how we use the euphemism international community to refer to the United States government or to the G7, etc. I mean, truly, the values of a country shouldn't be the country's own self-image. It should be the actions of a country. That's how we should judge the values of a country. Take the case of Afghanistan, United Kingdom, United States, all of you went with great guns firing to bring God knows what, human rights and other such, fantasies to the country by bombing the country. I mean, it was a ridiculous thing 20 years ago. And many of us said that it's not going to work, not the way you're doing it. It's brutal. You're going to kill millions of people, destroy lives. Well, after spending 2.6 trillion US dollars, United States government humiliated in Afghanistan. But look at it from this point of view. At the end of this 20-year period, 3/4 of Afghan households don't have electricity. 3/4. What was that $2.26 trillion spent on? And do you know the vaccination rate in Afghanistan? Have you bothered to look at it? Probably not. Because after all, the Afghans seem to have many more problems than COVID-19. Well, let me tell you, the vaccination rate this morning in Afghanistan is 1%. Yes, 1%. Where was that money spent? What was it spent on? It was spent on war. It was not spent on human decency. At Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, we've been talking about the 3 apartheids of our time, not just one. I know Dr. Tedros from the WHO has spoken specifically about vaccine apartheid, but we're talking about 3 apartheids. The first apartheid is financial apartheid. Did you know that last year, 64 countries of the 193 member states of the United Nations, 64 countries spent more on servicing their debt than they did on healthcare. In the middle of the pandemic, 64 countries were forced by wealthy bondholders to spend their precious money to fatten the coffers of the bondholders rather than take care of their population by enhancing public health systems. That's financial apartheid. No question from anybody about complete debt relief. Forget suspension of debt, forget new timetables, haircuts. We need complete debt relief. Put on the table reparations, put on the table restorative justice, put on the table the means to get rid of the debt overhang that doesn't allow countries to build up the kind of medical infrastructure that they require. The second form of apartheid is medical apartheid, not just vaccine apartheid. The entire pharmaceutical industry's way of putting countries over the barrel. We saw that with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. We're seeing it now again, and we'll see it again and again unless we break the medical apartheid, including the production of goods and services, the control of medical goods and services. The third form of apartheid is food apartheid. You know, something like 2.5 billion people out of 7.9 billion are struggling today with hunger. There's a lot of talk about, digital divides and so on. What digital divide? A hungry child has a sound in their head. They can't concentrate. They don't know what's happening around them. The question of a digital divide doesn't even appear. The chances are they don't even have electricity in their homes. They have no computers, no internet, no electricity, and a roaring sound in their head. That's the state of the world. If we're not going to confront the food apartheid, we're not really dealing with the most pressing problem in the world today, which is we're soon going to get to a situation where half the world's population struggles with hunger. Half the world's population, my friends, forget the sustainable development growths. We're going backwards by the day. As far as we are concerned, at Tricontinental and at the International People's Assembly, you've got to uplift what countries like Cuba, China, Russia, and others have been doing. These are countries with public sector pharmaceutical development, and they're the only ones who are saying, please take our vaccines. I'd like you to go to the website Cuba Nobel and join the campaign for the Cuban doctors to get the Nobel Prize for Peace. The Nobel Prize for Peace, it reduced its standing in the world when it gave its Nobel Prize to Barack Obama just when he became president, because you saw what happened in the 8 years after that, including the obscenity of drone strikes and drone attacks in Afghanistan. We think that the Nobel Prize has a chance to redeem their honor by applauding the Cuban doctors with a Nobel Prize. Part of fighting medical apartheid is fighting for medical solidarity. And that's exactly what the Cuban and Chinese doctors who are around the world in very poor places fighting against COVID day and night. We support them entirely. You've got AUKUS, you've got the ruckus being created by your governments as they bomb and destroy countries around the world. They claim there's no money for this, no money for that. They have trillions and trillions of dollars and euros and pounds, trillions of currency for war, but nothing for peace, pennies for peace, trillions and trillions of dollars for war, lots of hot air at the United Nations, but nothing for peace. Don't judge any of these governments. Don't judge your civilization based on its self-image. Don't allow yourself to judge your civilization based on its self-image. You should only be judged based on your actions. And as far as we are concerned, when you look at financial apartheid, when you look at medical apartheid, when you look at food apartheid, the global north comes off terribly. You're complaining about terrorism here and there. From the sightline of a young child in Afghanistan today, the real terrorist may not be the one patrolling their streets with guns. The real terrorist might be sitting in a bank somewhere, preventing that child from breathing. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Vijay. Now, we've got a message from the US, from one of the sponsors of this session. We got together with Progressive International and the National Nurses United trade union in the US, and their co-president, Deborah Berger, who's been to TWT before and would like to have come to this TWT but couldn't make it, is sending us a message of solidarity. And I think it's really important because we really need to get the unions engaged and involved in this campaign to work in solidarity with those global movements that we've heard from this evening if we want to make a breakthrough. And Deborah's union has done a fabulous job of both pushing President Biden into agreeing to the waiver, the patent waiver that we're calling for in the World Trade Organization, and now pushing him to put his money where his mouth is and make a reality of that demand. Over to Deborah.
Greetings. I'm Deborah Berger, RN and President of National Nurses United, the largest union of registered nurses in the United States. It's wonderful to be back at the World Transformed. NNU nurses know that an injury to one is an injury to all, especially during the global pandemic. That's why we're demanding vaccine equality now to protect nurses and our patients around the world. I've seen a lot in my many years as a nurse in America's dysfunctional healthcare system, but I never could have imagined how bad things would get during COVID-19. Decades of privatization and cuts to public health and social welfare left our patients and our communities vulnerable to the virus. Our healthcare corporations, like other capitalists, continued to put profits before people throughout the pandemic, leaving nurses and other frontline workers scrambling to protect ourselves. That's why almost 700,000 people have died of COVID in the United States, including at least 425 nurses and 24 members of my union. All of this has taken an immense physical, mental, and emotional toll on nurses. Imagine going to work at the height of the surge, not knowing if there'd be enough PPE for you. Imagine not being able to get to your critically ill patient in time because your hospital is severely short-staffed. It's also a similar story for millions of other frontline workers across the country who've been forced to work without adequate protections in the face of a chaotic and uneven public health response. Thankfully, the Biden administration has taken important steps to expand vaccination, address the economic crisis, and improve workplace protections for healthcare workers. But nurses know this pandemic is not over. We need to strengthen, not relax, infection control measures. We need stronger workplace protections for all workers. And of course, we need to ensure everyone can be vaccinated as soon as possible. We also know it's impossible to inoculate one nation in isolation. Despite 55% of our population being vaccinated, America is in the middle of a Delta-driven surge, with daily deaths approaching the same level as our very first peak in the spring of 2020. And globally, thousands are dying every day as emerging variants continue to spread. The Delta variant circled the globe after devastating India because of a vaccine apartheid. If we want to stop the spread of new variants and prevent millions more avoidable deaths, then we need vaccines to be available to everyone, everywhere. Nurses welcome President Biden's call to vaccinate 70% of the world within a year, but the time for action is now. We applaud the administration's promise to donate hundreds of millions of doses abroad and Biden's call to other wealthy nations to donate 1 billion additional doses on top of existing pledges. But we know these donations are still nowhere near enough. The truth is that countries across the global South have already the capacity to manufacture and distribute COVID-19 vaccines, but pharmaceutical monopolies are blocking them. Leaning on the global North governments to keep patent barriers in place, even though vaccine development was mostly funded by the public. NNU, together with our sister nurses unions organized in our global federation, Global Nurses United, and the Global Union Federation Public Services International, has stood with activists around the world in support of South Africa and India's proposal for a waiver of the WTO TRIPS agreement to bolster production and equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. We organized to put pressure on the Biden administration, and we cheered the historic announcement in May that the United States would support a waiver. But here we are 5 months later with no waiver because a handful of wealthy countries are standing in the way. And despite our official support, US representatives in Geneva have remained silent on the waiver issue in recent TRIPS council meetings. Holdouts like Germany, the UK, and Switzerland are not going to move until the US puts real pressure on them. The Biden administration needs to make it clear that it wants an outcome and needs to use all available diplomatic means to get the opposition to agree to a waiver now and ensure that the waiver covers not just the vaccines, but PPE, tests, treatments, and other crucial supplies. President Biden should also use his full authorities to require pharmaceutical companies to transfer technology and share their manufacturing know-how with manufacturers in the global South. The United States should invest heavily in increasing not only domestic vaccine manufacturing capacity, but global manufacturing capacity. Nurses know that it will take collective action on a mass scale to make this happen. In this last year, NNU has organized over 3,000 actions to force our employers and our government to give us the protections we need while caring for our patients and our communities. Our efforts have won us real influence in the Biden administration. But the fight for vaccine equity challenges the very foundations of neoliberal globalization and monopoly capital. And so we can't win this fight alone. So I invite all of you to join us at our organizing session tomorrow to help us build our movement for vaccine internationalism. This session is for people ready to roll up their sleeves and get to work, and you can join from anywhere in the world. NNU will provide the technology to help you contact tens of thousands of voters in the US, and our skilled Medicare for All organizers will be there to train and support you. Together, we can put pressure on the Biden administration to follow up with their good words, with good deeds and good action. NNU promises to stand with nurses, patients, our communities around the world, and to fight alongside all of you as long as it takes to achieve an equitable end to this pandemic, and to keep fighting to build a new system that finally puts people before profits. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so there's been a lot of talk tonight, but tomorrow, 7:30, we can have more discussion and some actual action, as Deborah talked about there, and some real, genuine transatlantic action. Normally we talk about solidarity and working across borders, but tomorrow we're actually going to do it, and it's going to be exciting, so do come along. Now, the last time I was in Brighton was 2019 for the Labour Party conference, and I can still remember the euphoria I felt when Jeremy Corbyn, as part of his leader speech to conference, right at the end of that conference, announced his plans to reform the pharmaceutical sector. Because already before COVID, it was completely clear that this was a sector that was dysfunctional, that spent more money, time, and resource enriching its shareholders than it did researching and developing essential medicines for the rest of the world. And the plan that Jeremy and my next speaker and the last speaker this evening put in place could have made such a difference. It's not nice to be proved right in the circumstances that we now face at a global level, but my goodness, we really have been proved right by the inability of the pharmaceutical sector to meet the needs and human rights of everyone in the world. I'm so happy that John has come back. He's had a hell of an evening. I think it's your third speech in about 3 hours, John. You need no introduction to this audience. Former Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, John McDonnell.
Thanks, Nick. I'm sorry I've been dashing about, and I wanted to be here early to listen to some of more of the discussions that's been taking place. I want to go through some of the principles which we're trying to organise around at the moment and convince people about the critical nature of this campaign. What is remarkable at the moment is that there is a building international movement around this, and it's giving confidence to a lot of people. And the issue that we've alighted upon, I suppose, is that vaccine nationalism is actually a death sentence in the global south. And we try to establish the principle as much as possible is that we're not safe until we're all safe. And it's so obvious, particularly now that the startling figures are coming out from some of the countries around the global south and elsewhere. And the reason for that is with the experience of the virus itself evolving. So the new variants emerging with, I suppose, variants which have greater resistance overall and therefore can create new crises, humanitarian crises. So they're the principles upon which we've been trying to organise the discussions that are taking place at the moment. And we've tried to argue, and this has been some of the debates within government and some of it in Parliament itself, is that what we've got to do is if we don't suppress it, everywhere, it will continue to evolve and it will kill more people, both around the world, but also just to strike home the relevance of it to the debate in this country, within the UK as well, of course. Now, there was a big fanfare at the G7 summit around the agreement to 870 million doses for poor countries through the WHO, and there was the COVAX procurement program. And we welcomed that, and we thought this was a huge breakthrough. But so far, in the monitoring that we've been doing, there's only 100 million that have actually been supplied. So it's been I suppose, having had the original fanfare, we're anxious about demoralising people about the lack of commitment that actually is to deliver. But it is something now that, in terms of certainly what we can do via the next round of discussions, that we want to highlight as much as possible. Some of you may have seen some of the work that Gordon Brown has done around this, and actually it's been superb. Gordon has actually taken it as one of his key campaigns through his various organisations, and what he's been doing is touring around. He's now a World Health Organization ambassador, but he's been touring around cajoling individual global leaders and pointing out that their huge stockpiles that they have at the moment could be and should be shared. And it's quite remarkable the way in which, I have to say, as an ex-Prime Minister in this country, it's rare for ex-Prime Ministers in this country to do nothing other than just line their pockets. What Gordon has done is actually committed himself to this cause, and he's worked incredibly hard. And I just want to quote from him, because it's worth saying it. He says, "Thousands will die this month and for the foreseeable future, not because there are too few vaccines being produced, but because they're being hoarded in places that now need them the least." And he's right. I was interested in the Ms. Berger reference to the role of capitalism in this is absolutely key. It's at the heart of capitalism is that concept of knowing the price of everything but not the value of nothing. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. And I think that's why we have to take life-saving drugs out of the capitalist system altogether. And we need now to, as part of this campaign, because it isn't just about this particular crisis, there'll be another one coming soon as well. And we've got to argue that we take the production of vaccines out of the capitalist system and therefore under public control and regulation. And in the policies that we were pursuing up to the last election, to be frank, public ownership as well, both in terms of production but also of the intellectual knowledge as well. So we need to do more than just transfer the excess supplies that we have. The point that was made by Ms. Berger was we need to be sharing the patents, the technologies, the licenses, and all the knowledge. And it's about enabling those countries to be able to manufacture the vaccines themselves. Now, there's been intense resistance across the pharmaceutical industry on anything that threatens their profit-making capacity. And they see this as a major assault on their operation. But it is a major assault on their operation. It is actually trying to ensure that actually vaccine production is no longer the high profiteering sector that it is at the moment. In 2019, it was mentioned, we published a detailed policy in this area. It was Medicines for the Many. And although it wasn't heavily featured in many of the campaigns that we made, it was quite key. And it was ensuring that at least in the first stage of a Labour government, the first Labour government 5-year programme, we would set up our own publicly owned, publicly managed, properly regulated pharmaceutical company, which would supply directly to the NHS and therefore reduce the cost of medicines overall. But it would have been ideally placed, well, when this COVID crisis hit, it would have been ideally placed, therefore, to ensure that there was a proper supply of vaccines, but also the supply of the knowledge and technology. And I think we need that health innovation model that is about people and not about profit. So it safeguards our NHS, it protects patients, but underpins public services around the world as well. And it's about ensuring that globally we can deliver healthcare, but we can deliver on the basis of equity as well. So I want to pay tribute to what Nick and Global Justice Now have done around this issue. In the debates in Parliament, we've tried to get across to government ministers and others that this is a matter of life and death. But it's a matter of life and death on a global scale that maybe we haven't seen for generations. And that traditional methods of working through the capitalist system have significantly failed and are failing at the moment. And they're failing not just in terms of the ability to tackle the various variants of this condition that come up. They're failing purely because of the inequitable distribution of that resource. I don't think future generations will ever forgive us if, when they look back and they see that the Western countries were sitting on supplies of vaccines while people were dying in the global south. I don't think they'll ever forgive us that we prevented them from producing their own vaccines within their own communities. And I don't think they'll ever forgive us as well for raising expectations and hopes about the distribution of vaccines and then delivering so poorly. I think there's a need now, as much as we possibly can, to raise this issue up the political agenda. The various work that Nick and others have been on has been incredibly creative, developing the ideas, putting the policies in place that are unchallengeable in terms of the ability pragmatically to be rolled out and be effective. But at the moment we lack that sort of, apart from political will, we lack at the moment a momentum of pressure on governments to do this. So I think now, as part of a wider social movement, the Labour Party actually has a specific role in this, in raising understanding, but then also explaining the solution and mobilising support for it. When you do talk to people, and I've done it in my own constituency, when you raise this issue and you talk through the potential that we have here, actually it does have a resonance, and I think it is becoming potentially quite a popular campaign that can have its effect. And it is about working upon the humanitarian commitment that people have, but also actually the guilt that is shared by governments now at their failure. This vaccine nationalism, as I said at the beginning, is a killer. And what we've got to do is do all we can to mobilise to ensure that we prevent profit before people within this pharmaceutical sector that has thought it could, over decades really, exploit the knowledge, because it's often knowledge developed publicly within our universities, our research laboratories, etc., that then for the profits that they've made. And the profits have been enormous throughout that period. So I just conclude on this. There's a movement here to build. The resources are available to us to ensure that we have a convincing narrative to mobilise people. So our job now is to do that mobilisation and do it on a scale. Before I stood down as Shadow Chancellor, we established an international forum where we brought together representatives of not just political parties, but mainly social movements across the world. And it was incredibly creative discussion about the issues that we were facing globally, obviously climate change, etc. But there were issues around poverty and deprivation, inequality, exploitation. But the issue about health came up throughout, and it was about, yes, health provision, but part of that was also about the role of pharmaceutical companies globally and how we can control them. Well, in the policies that we set out, we were taking the first step towards that. And I think the time has come now that we can win that argument, then mobilise the movement to enable that to happen. If we were still in the leadership positions, we'd make sure that rolled out. In the Labour Party now, with the new leadership, this is, I think, a policy that can be won and retained and developed. The right have been bankrupt of ideas for generation now. The left have the creative ideas we've put forward. I actually think with the Labour Party now, we could win the argument, ensure that we get it into the next manifesto, and whilst we're doing that, becoming part of a mobilising support force around this particular issue. So I'm confident we can, but I think we need determination to do it. But the determination comes from as a result of watching what's happening in the global south as this pandemic feeds into incredible levels of human suffering and inhumanity. So it means a solidarity and commitment on a global stage, but I think we could potentially do that. Solidarity. Thanks.
Thanks so much, John, not just for coming this evening, but for your consistent support on this issue and your championing of this issue in Parliament and outside. The Medicines for the Many, which John mentioned there, is a blueprint, a framework, which gives us something to mobilise around on this issue. And although there's a lot that's been said tonight, which really makes you close to despair of the state of the world, there's also some real hope when you're working on this every day. I think the first bit of hope, as John mentioned there, is that what we're calling for here is actually popular. Opinion poll after opinion poll here in the global north suggests people, between 2/3 and 3/4 of the population, are in favour of waiving patents on everything related to COVID, vaccine, treatments, equipment, the whole lot. Most people find it abhorrent that corporations are making a fortune while people are dying and unable to access these life-saving medicines. So, and I think in many ways it's not surprising that that's popular because, you know, after the Second World War, we decided as a country that healthcare was something that was too important to be left any longer to the market and to capitalism, and we created the NHS to remove our healthcare from the market mechanism, at least by and large. And I think it's clearly most people find the NHS one is still one of the most popular aspects of the British economy and British society. And so I think it's no wonder that we can win that argument as to why essential medicines and essential healthcare should be completely removed from the market mechanism. And we need to do that going forward. We've got a number of actions coming up, and I'll very briefly talk about them. But the second bit of hope for me is that I feel like global South governments have begun to find their confidence on this issue. If you look at the incredible revolutionary technology behind the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines called mRNA, you probably know all about it, that technology allows us not only to inoculate ourselves against COVID, but potentially to completely transform our medical system. They are talking now about using it to create HIV/AIDS vaccines, vaccines for certain types of cancer, vaccines for malaria. It could completely revolutionize our medical system. And that's why Pfizer and Moderna are so desperate not to share that technology. Because Pfizer this year is expecting to make on its vaccine $35 billion of one vaccine, the most profitable medicine of any sort in world history. Next year it's expected to make $50 billion. And that's just on the COVID vaccine. Imagine if they're allowed to monopolize this technology for the next 20 years and decides who gets it and who isn't. And you know what? Southern governments are just saying no. So the WHO has backed a technology transfer hub in Southern Africa. They're now looking at one in Asia too. Moderna has, they're going to try and make the Moderna vaccine. Moderna has refused to share the recipe for its vaccine, which is scandalous. The CEO of Moderna has become a billionaire thanks to this vaccine, which was made 100% with public money, public research entirely. And Moderna, despite having, he's already become a billionaire, is refusing to share the recipe. But you know what? The mRNA hub has just said, we're going to reverse engineer it. We're going to make it anyway. We're going to work out how to make it. Now, unfortunately, tens of thousands of people will die because it will take longer for them to make it, but nonetheless, they are going to make it. I think the global south is absolutely clear. They are not going to go into another medical emergency like they went into this one. And so our job is to support and offer our solidarity to those governments doing that work and to do everything we possibly can to challenge the pharmaceutical corporations based here and to challenge our government, which, as we've said time and again this evening, along with Germany, are now the leading bloc blockers of any kind of patent waiver at the World Trade Organization. And there's two things I'd like to leave you with tonight. There's been a lot of talk this evening. You've heard a lot of information. I'm really sorry that we didn't have a chance to hear from you. But tomorrow night at 7:30, there is going to be a session where we discuss, we talk, we organize, and we mobilize. And we actually do some direct action as well. So please come along to that 7:30 tomorrow. Secondly, we're organizing a major action on the 12th of October. On the 13th and 14th of October, the World Trade Organization will be holding a key meeting where, again, after a year after South Africa and India put the potential for a TRIPS waiver on the table, an intellectual property waiver, they will negotiate it at the World Trade Organization mid-October. The day before, our ambassador goes and tries to block this at the World Trade Organization. We want to call a day of shame in this country, and we're going to be organizing activities and protests in Westminster. So please, at the back, as you go out, Alina will have not just some lovely t-shirts that you can buy, like mine, but she's also got some QR codes, and you can put them into your phone, and you can get involved in an organizing group to plan that. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks everybody who's watching this online. I really hope that you found this informative, useful, and also not just depressing, but actually hopeful, because I really mean it. There has not been a time since the late 90s, early 2000s, where people, activists, governments from around the world, diplomats, former leaders, as John said, not even just Gordon Brown, but former leaders from around the world have said, actually, life is more important than intellectual property. The healthcare is more important than profits. We need to transform this system. This is our moment to do that. So please join us and create that better world. I'm going to leave you with a little People's Vaccine song to sing you on your way this evening, and hope to see you again over the rest of the World Transformed, hopefully tomorrow night. Thank you.
Who owns the patent on this vaccine? Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. This is... Could you patent the sun? Who owns the patent on this vaccine? The people, I would say. Who owns the patent on this vaccine? Could you patent the sun? Who owns the patent on this vaccine? The people, I would say. Who owns the patent on this vaccine? Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
It's for the people. I think that is an answer to that myth.
Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
It's for the people. I think that is an answer to that myth.
Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
It's for the people.
Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
It's for the people.
Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? There is no patent. There is no patent. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
It's for the people. I think that is an answer to that myth.
Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
It's for the people. I think that is an answer to that myth.
Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Patent the sun? There is no patent. There is no patent. There is no patent. patent the sun? Would you patent the sun? 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 Patent the sun?